The wind howled low across the plains like a ghost trying to be remembered. Elijah Hart sat alone on the porch of his rundown ranch house, a single match burning between calloused fingers. He didn't light it for warmth. He didn't smoke. He just liked the way it flickered, how even fire fought to stay alive in a place this barren. It had been 8 months since Elijah last spoke to anyone. The old cowboy wasn't mean or dangerous. He was just broken. After losing his wife to pneumonia last winter and his only son to a riding accident the summer before, Elijah had folded into himself like a collapsing barn. He stopped going into town. Stopped answering the sheriff's letters about overdue taxes. Stopped feeding the horses, what few were left, until one morning they were simply gone. All that remained was silence. And the ache that silence left behind. That was, until the day of the runaway bride. It was a Saturday. Mid-June. The kind of hot that made you feel like God had forgotten to close the oven door. Elijah had just finished mending a busted fence post out by the creek when he saw something strange down the dusty road leading into Coyote Ridge, the nearest town, a good 12 miles east. It looked like a cloud of lace and dust, kicking up with panic and purpose. As it came closer, Elijah could hardly believe his eyes. A woman, no, a bride, was stumbling straight toward his land in full wedding dress, veil tangled in sagebrush, bouquet long forgotten. And then, without a sound, she collapsed face first in the dirt. Elijah hesitated. His boots rooted to the ground like they weren't sure if they remembered how to move. He looked toward the horizon, half expecting someone to follow her. But the land was still. Silent. He walked toward her slowly, unsure if this was real or some cruel trick of the heat. When he reached her, he knelt beside her trembling form. She was breathing, but barely. Her face was pale beneath a veil soaked in sweat. Her lips were cracked and dry. She needed water. Fast. For the first time in months, Elijah's voice cracked through the still air. "Hang on, miss," he said, barely recognizing his own voice. "I got you." He lifted her gently, cradling her like he'd once carried his son after his first broken arm. She weighed nothing, like sorrow and silk. He carried her into the house and laid her on the old sofa by the window. The place was a mess, dishes untouched, floor unswept, but he didn't care. He brought her water, cool from the hand pump. Wet a cloth, pressed it to her forehead. Waited. After nearly half an hour, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and tearful. Where am I?" "You're safe," Elijah said softly. "Out near Red Rock. You ran through half a mile of scrub in satin heels. That takes grit." The woman blinked up at him, trying to sit up, then winced. Elijah steadied her with a hand. "Easy now." She looked at him. Really looked. At the weathered face, the silvered hair tucked under a dusty hat, the eyes haunted but kind. "You're the cowboy who lives out here," she whispered. "I reckon so," Elijah replied. Then, her breath caught. And she began to cry. Her name was Caroline Whitmore. 26. Daughter of the town's wealthiest banker. She was supposed to be married that morning to Peter Langford, a well-dressed lawyer from Chicago who'd shown up in town 2 years ago, talking sweet and spinning dreams of high society. But standing at the altar, Caroline said, something inside her broke. It wasn't fear of commitment. It wasn't cold feet. It was something deeper. "I looked into his eyes," she said, "and I realized I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't know myself. I've lived my whole life being told who to be. I ran because I needed air. And somehow, I ran to you." Elijah poured her another cup of water and leaned against the doorframe. "Folks don't usually run to me," he said with a quiet half-smile. "They mostly just leave." "I didn't know where else to go," Caroline admitted. "I just remembered seeing your ranch when I was little. Thought it looked peaceful. He nodded slowly. It is. Quiet's all I got left. She looked at him then, with gentle curiosity. What happened? Elijah took a breath, deep and sharp, like a man preparing to dive into cold water. And then, to his own surprise, he told her. About his wife, Mary, who made the best peach pie west of the Mississippi and danced barefoot in the rain. About his son, Luke, who used to lasso fence posts for fun and dreamed of riding in the Cheyenne rodeo. And about the storm that took them both away. How grief silenced him. How silence nearly buried him. Caroline listened, eyes wide and wet, hands clasped in her lap. When he finished, she whispered, "I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have had to carry that alone." Elijah looked out the window. You never think you'll be the last one standing. They sat in silence for a while, two souls who had both run from different things but somehow ended up in the same quiet room. Over the next few days, Caroline stayed. She helped clean the place up, scrubbing dishes and sweeping dust like a woman possessed. She helped patch up the barn roof, even though she'd never held a hammer before. They worked in silence most of the time, but a comfortable one. Caroline began to laugh again. Elijah began to speak more. She found one of Mary's old dresses in a trunk and wore it to feed the chickens. Elijah found himself smiling without realizing it. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the buttes and painted the world in gold, Caroline stood on the porch with Elijah and said quietly, "I think I'm supposed to be here." Elijah didn't answer right away. He stared out across the land, at the hills and grass that had once only reminded him of loss. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe I am too." The town, of course, was buzzing. A runaway bride vanishing into the desert was the kind of thing they'd talk about for years. Peter Langford searched for a day or two, then left town in a huff, muttering about backwards places and mad women. Caroline's father rode out with the sheriff once they got word she was spotted near Red Rock. But when they found her, healthy, peaceful, standing beside the quiet cowboy who hadn't spoken in months, they hesitated. Her father looked like he might yell, but Caroline raised a hand. "I'm not a possession," she said calmly. "I'm your daughter. And I need to find out who I am, outside the dresses and expectations. This place, it saved me." The sheriff gave a knowing nod. He'd lost his own brother to grief once. He understood. Caroline's father left without another word. The weeks turned into months. Caroline stayed on the ranch, helping Elijah fix it up piece by piece. He taught her how to ride properly. She taught him how to listen to music again. They planted wildflowers by Mary and Luke's graves. Laughed over burnt stew. Watched lightning storms roll in from the porch. And one evening, as the cicadas sang and the stars bloomed above them, Caroline looked over and whispered, "You gave me hope when I'd lost it." Elijah turned to her, eyes softer than they'd been in years. "No," he said. "You gave it back to me." A year later, the ranch was unrecognizable. Fences mended. Barn painted. Horses back in the stables. And on one perfect spring morning, the townspeople gathered at the small chapel by the creek. This time, Caroline wore no veil. No corset. Just a simple white dress and wildflowers in her hair. And the man waiting at the altar? Not a lawyer. Not a banker. Just a quiet cowboy with silvered hair and a heart stitched back together. As Elijah took Caroline's hands in his, the preacher looked out at the crowd. Every face touched by the story that had unfolded quietly in the hills, and said, "Sometimes, love doesn't gallop in loud and proud. Sometimes, it stumbles in the dust, collapses from the heat, and is brought back to life by hands that still remember how to heal." Epilogue. They never became rich. They never left the ranch. But every Sunday, people from all around came by for supper, for stories, for warmth. Elijah and Caroline's love became legend, not because it was flashy or easy, but because it was real. And in a world that often forgets how to pause and care, their story reminded folks of something important. That even the loneliest hearts can be revived. That kindness heals deeper than medicine. And that sometimes, hope shows up, wearing satin heels and falling into your arms.